Hey group, this is Patty the TA. I really enjoyed watching everyone's videos, particularly just seeing people live and in color in the flesh. This is my son Leo, so please excuse his babbling. But I just wanted to add a couple things to think about in terms of racial identity and how it intersects with our practice, individually, organizationally, community-wise. So a couple things. One thing that I wanted to add is that I know many folks identified that one of the privileges that comes with whiteness is being able to be seen as an individual instead of representing a whole group, an entire group of people. And I just wanted to add to that as well that I think that one of the privileges that comes with that too is the privilege of also being considered the norm. And the reason I lift that up is because I think when you're considered the norm, you almost get to be invisible. Your race gets to be invisible. And it's kind of the default position of so many things. So I just wanted to point that out to have folks be critically aware of it and to also name it. Connected to that, I wanted to say another way that kind of whiteness dominates social work practice and our settings and spaces, basically how it intersects with social work, is that when we look at, I'm sure you already know this, right? So like when you look at the history of social work, kind of when you look under the hood of many of the interventions that are out there, a lot of the evidence-based practices, even the human development theories, right? Like when you look at human development theories, they were mostly constructed by middle-class, educated white men who, never acknowledged that the lens that they were looking through the world in, and instead we've created these theories that we apply to humans in general, in terms of like, this is how you work with children, this is how you work with families, this is how you work with people in midlife and beyond. And when we look under the hood of a lot of those theories and constructs, they're very much centered in whiteness because they were created by white people, and often a lot of that research was based on white people. So I bring this up because a lot of the times in social work, our interventions and approaches are cookie cutter. I know we all strive to get away with this, right? Because we have family-centered, individual-centered care, and that's all good and well, but often we do have more kind of global frameworks that we apply our interventions. And those cookie cutter interventions, I just want to point out, are often centered in whiteness and centered particularly in Eurocentric cultural norms and values. So I want to lift that up. And why am I saying it? Not just to lift it up and interrupt white supremacy and superiority, but also to say we're going to have trouble applying those same frameworks and constructs and interventions to folks who don't identify as Euro or as white, excuse me. So, what is that going to cause? What kind of issues is that going to cause for us? Something that was an evidence-based practice working with, rural Iowa with young white girls is not going to work super well, right? If you're looking at first and second generation Latina youth at a high school in California, So basically, I just wanted to lift that piece up. Another thing I wanted to say regarding whiteness as well, and of course, I didn't mention this before, this is all me speaking as an outsider into kind of how I see whiteness play out, right? Because I'm not white and I identify as a person of color. So another thing I wanted to mention is that one thing to be aware of, and I say this both as something that's going to be a challenge for folks of color and maybe also a challenge for white folks, I don't know, because I'm not a white person, but is that when we in our organizations are doing the good work of doing equity, inclusion, and justice work, particularly around the lines of race, particularly when folks are starting in the journey, whether it's an organization that's first starting to actually talk about these things in public, in trainings, in forums, in group discussions, and or if it's individuals for the first time thinking about the intersection of race and their work and practice, a lot of the times these introductory spaces are going to start by default. They're going to start centered in whiteness, and that's going to feel really frustrating for folks of color for the most part. I'm sure for folks of color who are in the program, you already felt this as you walked through the program. I know I did when I was in grad school too. And so there's an element there of people of color feeling, I think, a couple things. One is just super frustrated, and it can be really painful to have to sit in these conversations because a person of color by default typically is coming into these conversations and narratives around equity, justice, solidarity work with a little bit more personal and lived experience. And so kind of having to wait for white people to catch up can be really painful. It can be really frustrating. For many people, they could say, hey, I'm not willing to wait, because our communities have been waiting for so long. So I just wanted to lift a name that can be a challenging part of how whiteness sort of creeps into particular spaces, especially in doing social justice work. So I just wanted to lift that up. And then in terms of folks of color and racial identity and intersecting with our practice and the social work field in general, I wanted to say a couple things. One is that I think that one of the challenges that's going to come for us as folks of color in doing this and doing social work is that you might, especially when organizations and institutions are, again, starting kind of on the journey of either cultural responsiveness, cultural specificity, equity, inclusion, diversity, blah, blah, et cetera, you might be looked to as and or volunteered to kind of know it all and be it all in terms of representing community, in terms of knowing how to do all this work, in terms of being able to engage in community. And that's not to say we can't, we don't, and we shouldn't, but I just want to name that it can be a burden sometimes, and it might be an assumption that people have. That being said, I think that's all I'll say on that piece. And then the other piece I wanted to add for folks of color as an asset that I didn't hear too many folks identify is that particularly for those of us who are biracial or bicultural, while yes, it's a challenge that we don't fit in either world sometimes, I just want to lift up and really affirm for us that one of the benefits that comes is that we have been able to be both kind of insider and outsider to both dominant culture world and community world. And by community, I mean like your people of color world community. And in a way, you learn how to code switch, right? You know how to rock it and how to walk and how to talk in the white space. And then you can code switch and you know how to talk with community and you know how to do that work. You know how to kind of switch your thinking and your speaking. And of course, this is not in any manipulative or intentionally like strategic way. It's just one of the benefits and beauties of being a bicultural person and often being a person of color who has experience in kind of the white world. You learn that ability. It's a resilience and survival tactic. And then I just want to lift up and say, hey, it's also something that we can use to our advantage in our work. And it's an asset and skill that you have in your career as a social work practitioner. So I just also wanted to name that. So I think that's it. Let me look at my notes here. Yeah. So, all right. That's it.